Hello, I'm Adam Harris, a staff writer at The Atlantic. Thank you for joining us for this week's edition of The Big Story, a digital event series where we speak with Atlantic writers about their latest reporting. In the past few weeks, much of our work at The Atlantic has been focused on the biggest story in America, protests and policing after the murder of George Floyd. As our readers will know, this is just the latest in a long series of instances of police violence against Black people, and the calls to reimagine our justice system have been growing louder. Specifically, the calls to defund the police. But what would defunding the police actually look like? I'm joined by my colleague, Atlantic staff writer Annie Lowrey, who wrote about this topic earlier this week. Before we begin our conversation, I want to remind our viewers that you can be a part of it. You can do that by typing your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. I will incorporate them throughout the next 30 or 40 minutes. Keep your questions short and on topic, and be sure to tell us where you're watching from. Now, let's dive in. So Annie, first, thanks for joining us. I want to start with the big question that you ask at the beginning of your piece. And it is a big question, so you can kind of take it any direction that you'd like. But what are the police for?
So I think that we can think of the police as having kind of two functions. So one is to deter crime, and then the other is to investigate and to start the process of involving the criminal justice system for criminals. And so I think that the largely peaceful protests that we've seen over the past few weeks have brought kind of both of those functions into question, particularly because we saw these remarkable incidents of police-incited violence against nonviolent protesters. And so I think it raised that question of, right, what are the police for if they're not there to protect? And they were really responsible for a lot of the violence that we did see at these protests across the country.
Yeah, and so the calls to defund the police are kind of in response to that kind of bifurcated responsibility of policing, kind of saying that police might be doing some things that maybe should be tasked to other entities in society. So I guess in practice, what does defunding the police mean, and what would that look like?
Yeah, so it's a really good question because this is complicated, right? This is a 3-word slogan, sort of like abolish ICE or make America great again, and it obscures a lot of policy nuance. So I think the first thing to know about this is that this is not new. I think that probably this is the first time over the past 3 weeks or so that a lot of people have heard this, but this has been a long time request of academics, social justice campaigners, activists, groups like the Movement for Black Lives. And so what does defund the police mean? I like to look at it at the kind of broadest sense of what do we spend on in the United States? And we spend more than most of our peer nations on policing and courts and that apparatus. We spend much more on things like prisons, and we spend much more on the defense apparatus as a general point. And notably, we spend a lot less on social insurance and social welfare than our other peer countries do. And by peer countries, I mean countries like Japan, a lot of the big European countries that are sort of perhaps smaller than the United States, but are similar in terms of GDP per capita and often have not entirely dissimilar systems of government. And so, within defund, right, like, so what does that mean? I think that in a lot of cases, at least for some activists, it means literally defunding, right? Shrinking police departments, having fewer police officers, and shifting that money over to finance things that are going to make communities safe in a broader sense. So education, housing, that kind of thing. But then I think when you look at like, what would defunding the police actually mean? What would we want to defund first? There are sort of more concrete policy asks that are probably less controversial. So getting rid of fines and fees policing, stopping things like the militarization of police, stopping having police officers in schools is a big ask, and then starting to think about interactions where we task the police with the interaction, but probably could be tasked with a different type of agency. So a good example of this is traffic stops. If you get stopped, it's likely you're stopped by a highway patrol officer or a police officer for something like having a tail light out or speeding, some kind of minor traffic crime that I think probably all of us do at some point or another and probably get pulled over for. There's really no reason that the cops need to do that. And very often those incidents escalate into really, really dangerous incidents, and especially for Black Americans. So the Sandra Bland death, I think, was one that really drew attention to this. There's other things that probably don't need to be the responsibility of police necessarily. Wellness checks and interactions with people who are unhoused is a big one, that perhaps we could have other social service agents start to take that over. And the police would therefore just be interfacing less, and we might actually get sort of better social service provision to those kinds of, those people that often need help, and could go through a kind of dispute resolution mechanism instead.
So there's actually a Q&A that kind of bounces a little bit off of that last answer. So Jean Golden writes, I find the term defund to be a punitive sounding, threatening term to keep the positive energy of the protest. What about using a different, clearer verb, such as reform and or de-escalate? And that's kind of been something that's kind of been percolating in the broader conversation. Can you kind of discuss why the term defund is being used by activists as opposed to some other verb, as we've seen kind of some politicians do?
Mm-hmm. So it's a really great question. And I think that there's sort of at least two camps on this. So there's kind of a camp that's concerned that people will hear defund the police and they'll say, well, hang on, there's still a lot of crime in my community. I want to reform the cops. I don't want to defund them. I want my neighborhood to be safer, right? And so there might be a kind of backlash against that. And then I think that there are folks who sort of believe that, defunding the police across all of the police departments across the United States, there's currently 18,000 different police departments in the United States, has expanded kind of the Overton window of policy optionality in a really important way that it has made, Scott Walker, of all people, come out and say that he's for police reform, which is really not something that you heard Republican politicians talking about even just a couple months ago. And so, yeah, I think that activists very clearly want police defunding. I think that is important to note, but there's really a range of policy options beyond that people are talking about that would probably be a lot more likely to happen. And so I think that you get into this kind of like linguistic, right? Should we be talking about reforming the police instead? Police reform often doesn't work that well, is a complaint that activists have, that, you can look at actually the Minneapolis Police Department. This is in a very progressive city. They've had all sorts of anti-bias training, use of force trainings, and they still, have tons and tons of complaints about use of force, and obviously are still killing people. And so I think that there's just a lot of tension and complexity there, but I'll be interested to see if people kind of pivot to a different slogan. Quite notably, Joe Biden, Democratic candidate for president, has sort of said he is not supporting defunding the police, but is very much supporting other options to help end racial bias in policing, help prevent police brutality against Black Americans. And so I imagine that the Democratic Party is going to move in that direction of not sort of embracing the slogan, but embracing a lot of the ideas.
And when you mentioned former Vice President Biden, yesterday he called for $300 million in additional funds for kind of community policing. And I know a lot of activists say, if you're already going to call for that money, why not try distributing that to something like education or something like housing? I guess what kind of drives that impulse to kind of direct towards more funding for the police? Like, is it just kind of there was a piece that stuck out in a line that stuck out in your piece where you said a thin safety net and expansive security, expansive security state. That's the American way. I guess what is kind of driving that impulse?
So if you poll voters and you ask them whether they want more cops in their communities, both white voters and Black voters notably say yes. And I think that that's a reflective of the fact that the United States deals with more crime, particularly violent crime, than our peer countries do. And there's complicated really reasons for that. I think at least some of it has to do with the fact that we have these enormously lax gun laws, for instance. So I don't want to say that that is necessarily a result of policing, but we have both more policing than other countries and more crime. Notably also clearance rates. So the rate at which cops solve crimes is enormously low in a lot of major cities and for a lot of police departments. And I think that that leads to a lot of community frustration, including in predominantly Black communities. And I think a lot of people have an experience of this. I have one personally, which is that a good friend of mine, gosh, it was a decade ago, was shot twice in the abdomen in Washington, D.C. And the cops didn't, the cops in the justice system, they didn't catch who did it. And they didn't even put that much effort into trying to figure it out. I think a lot of people have this experience of, hey, my house got robbed and they didn't even try to figure it out, or my car got stolen. And so I think that there's a lot of kind of competing impulses here. And I think that even if people say, yeah, I want to stop police brutality, they also say, in many cases, my community doesn't feel completely safe. And in some ways, I would like a stronger community policing presence. There's really interesting research that shows that one of the most powerful and effective things that cops can do to prevent crime is just to patrol in their neighborhoods, right? Literally not to engage in interactions with anybody, but just to be a presence, not to do traffic stops, not to be picking people up for, minor crimes that are often not really even crimes, like loitering, literally just be physically present in the community. And so I think that there's just tension and confusion. And again, I think that voters have very competing impulses on all of this, given, also just how different communities are and kind of how balkanized this system is.
And so over time, this is not a new thing. There's police brutality.
Yeah.
People have been killed, Black people in particular have been killed kind of in large numbers by police over the last several decades. And kind of each time, I read a piece last week that was kind of each time there is something like this, anytime there's kind of this mass unrest in the nation, there's this rush to call for commissions to study what's going on. And a lot of that has led to a laundry list of recommendations. Like, America knows exactly what it needs to do. And this kind of gets to two questions that we have. Actually, a couple of questions, one from Long Beach, one from St. Paul, Minnesota. That's, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. I guess, is there kind of any precedent that we can look to that kind of examines some of these questions and solutions that America kind of implement in a short manner of time?
Yeah, so I would point to actually a lot of examples that we can look to for alternative models or things that have worked. So one kind of example that I like to point to is a program in Oregon called Cahoots. And what Cahoots does is it has trained mental health professionals and other trained professionals do a lot of calls that otherwise would be picked up by the police. And this has worked really well as a kind of diversionary effort to make sure that we are not sort of criminalizing behavior that doesn't need to be criminalized, leading to escalations and incarcerations that are sort of unnecessary, again, for things that, we're not talking about giant burglaries here, right? We're talking about wellness checks and those kinds of calls where people might need social services much more so than they need the police there. So that's one. Another that I'd point to as kind of an interesting sort of radical reform that happened was in Camden, New Jersey. And so there, to get around the kind of police union, they actually disbanded the police force entirely and rebuilt it. And this ended up being pretty successful in terms of making Camden safer and reducing some of these markers of kind of bad police departments that are, brutalizing citizens instead of sort of protecting them. Notably in Camden, they actually ended up with more police officers, but so a bigger force, but it was seen as this kind of radical reform that actually worked, of sort of just taking the entire department across. Everybody had to reapply for their jobs, and some folks didn't get their jobs back. And then there is just a tremendous amount of research about reforms that could work. And sometimes that research is contradictory, and sometimes we don't know enough. But some of it is fairly straightforward in terms of, what demilitarizing would look like, what taking cops out of schools would look like, that kind of thing. And I think that there's now just a tremendous amount of interest in all of this, of what we know and what would kind of make things better here. But again, it's a complicated issue, complicated by the fact that these are departments that are hired and structured under state and local laws. And again, there's 18,000 of them. And so, in some ways, doing federal reforms is more straightforward when you can just think about sort of individual laws and single government, but this is a really complicated issue.
So I'll actually want to come back to federal reforms momentarily, but you mentioned kind of Camden disbanding its police union. I guess for cities that aren't willing to take such a radical step to kind of disband the police force, I should say, whose kind of police unions are still in effect. I guess this is a question from Gray. I guess what happens if the police union is unsupportive of reform efforts or kind of these defunding efforts?
It's a really hard issue. It's a really, really hard question. And there's a lot of concern and churn in the union movement about whether unions writ large want to step away from police unions, which have been seen as protecting kind of officers who have use of force complaints against them, sort of protecting the bad apples, as it were, and preventing departments from firing, from moving people out. This is a really tough question, and it's something that's come up a lot in the context of Minneapolis. There's been a lot of complaints from politicians in Minneapolis that the department functionally retaliates against politicians who try to implement reforms, that police officers all of a sudden would stop responding in some cases to police calls, to 911 calls, and that kind of thing. I think that this is just a really tough question, and there's just been an enormous amount of energy put into asking how to change this, how to reform unions, to de-unionize police officers, or otherwise kind of get around this union question. I'm not sure that we have totally great answers yet, but I think, again, it's a place where there's just a tremendous amount of interest currently in removing these obstacles to reform.
And so on the question of the federal government, you were mentioning that there are some ways in which the federal government, it might be easier to do some of these reforms through kind of some of the federal levers. But we have kind of seen several cities implement things like banning no-knock warrants, banning chokeholds, different things like that. And that's typically through the support of the city council and kind of local leaders. But the federal government is a different beast, trying to move a piece of legislation, particularly we have different party control in the House and the Senate, is going to be a very difficult thing. I guess, how likely is it that that federal reform actually happens?
So I think it's probably quite unlikely that federal reform will happen. Republicans on the Hill have not shown a tremendous amount of interest in this issue. And all of the signaling that we've gotten from the White House is about law and order, which President Trump keeps on tweeting out just the words law and order, law and order, law and order. What we need is more police, more policing, and we need to stop criminal behavior. And that's his emphasis and has always been his emphasis. And so I think it's quite unlikely right now that we would see any kind of federal reform. But again, states and cities have way more control over this process. And I think that you will start to see states and cities moving with different paces of rapidity and different willingness to try kind of more radical solutions. And so, you know, we'll get that sort of laboratory of democracy effect, where I think places like Minneapolis and in California, there's a lot of movement towards taking pretty bold steps to reallocate funding and to bring police departments more in line with what voters are asking for in some cases. But I think you're right? Like, first of all, the federal government has probably limited sway in terms of what it can get states and cities to do. And then also at the federal level, I think it's highly unlikely that you would see a lot of legislation on this, at least until the next congressional session.
And we had a question from Ramona that says, practically speaking, is defunding police an easier path to reform than decriminalizing things that arguably shouldn't be funneled into the criminal justice system? Which kind of bounces off this recent question of it might be difficult to decriminalize things at the federal level just because there's such a standstill. But yeah. I guess is it easier to defund police at a local level?
So I think that defunding the police in the local level, it might be politically challenging for many places. If you look at what even Democrats who successfully run for office on, they often run promising to expand policing, right? To stop crime in neighborhoods. And that's actually been a really popular thing. Voters like that, including Democratic voters, right? Nobody wants to live in an unsafe community. Whereas I think reforming the police has been sort of a less popular plank for, again, even Democratic folks to run on. Though if that's changing, given that public perception of the Black Lives Matter movement, public perception and understanding of racism in America and especially anti-Black racism is changing really quickly. And so I think that you're seeing a really fast realignment in the party where all of a sudden this is becoming an issue where folks, you know, want to respond, want to figure out where progressives are, want to figure out where activists are, want to figure out where their own voters are. But to circle back to the question more specifically, I actually think that changing what is criminal is, as well as changing who is responding to those quote unquote criminal complaints, is a really important component of this, and has always been part of activists' demands. If you look at activist groups, they've suggested, right, like the decriminalization or legalization of drugs, for instance, has been a really important plank of the broader reform and defund movement and even abolition movements, given that relatively minor drug crimes, again, are often a pretext for these kind of escalating incidents. And so when DC, for example, decriminalized marijuana, it no longer was probable cause for the cops to stop people if they seemed like they were smoking. And so that kind of closes off that pathway for the cops to then escalate incidents. And again, I think we can think about this also in terms of the kind of unbundling police responsibilities and giving them to other agencies, right? If so here in San Francisco, the cops respond to a huge volume of 911 and 311 calls where the primary complaint is just that a person who is unhoused is existing, right? Like they're loitering, or, you know, they've put a tent up on my street and I don't want it there. And often those incidents don't end with, you know, an ambulance being called, social services being brought in, housing agencies or nonprofits being brought in. They often end up with citations being given and the underlying problem not being solved. So I think that that's going to be a really big part of this. And again, I think that the complaint that we're hearing from a lot of people is, right, like if we solved our issue with homelessness, if we funded schools appropriately, if we ended child poverty and stopped criminalizing, the criminalization of poverty has been a really big issue over the last 20 years, where you've seen lots of statutes that are doing things like banning sleeping in cars, right? Like, do we need to change those laws? I think that thinking about this sort of architecturally in terms of the legal system is a really smart way to do it. And it's something that, again, activists have been pressing for.
So I've been thinking about, because my primary beat used to be higher education. And so just been thinking about how states have kind of been defunding higher ed over the last decade, 2 decades, in this context of how they would build out supports if they were to defund the police. America's not necessarily been great with building out social programs or funding them at adequate enough levels for them to be effective. So Bruce Gruen has a question that says, could defunding lead to the privatization of many aspects of current police responsibilities? Where you can very well see in kind of America's economy where cottage industries could pop up to kind of serve as these markers of social responsibilities that the police were formerly holding. You think of student loan servicing, where people are historically unhappy with their student loan servicing.
Yep. I think it's a great question. And here, I think that where a lot of work has been done on this is on the prison abolition side. There's been for a very long time calls to stop the privatization and private provision of prisons. And on the policing side, I think that it becomes a little bit more complicated, because I think legally there's this question as to whether private citizens and private firms can act as police in that sort of way. But I think it's a really, really good question, because you're right that in the United States, as a general point, we have less provision of public goods than our peer countries by a lot. And we have kind of private entities that often step in either to do the work of government or to provide services that governments don't provide. And so I think it's a really good issue to raise, also because you've seen the rise of things like private fire services in really high-income neighborhoods, private security teams in really high-income neighborhoods. And I think that that's a relatively minor phenomenon now, but obviously I think it would be quite concerning if it became a really broad one. And really the call here at the highest level is for the funding of public goods that people really want. Right? People want a better education system with more financing. People want the end of homelessness in the United States. People want, childcare systems, public transportation systems, all of these things where the United States really lags its peer countries. And so I think that that's a really important part of this, is that this is not just a call to, cut cops' salaries and get rid of cops. It's also to look at what we're not spending on compared to countries like Japan, Korea, and France.
So James Gardner from New York has a question. He says, following up on your observations about wellness checks, has there been more national focus on the greater likelihood that persons with mental illness are more than 15 times more likely to die in encounters with police? So if cops were to be patrolling, just kind of patrolling neighborhoods, not trying to do interactions with people, do you still think that presence and potentially saying something that to them may seem out of the ordinary could lead to a deadly encounter?
Yeah. So I think it's a great question. And here we have models. So we have places both in the United States and abroad where you have kind of social service rapid response teams. So people who are specially trained in mental health, wellness, and preparedness. So you can, and also sometimes in substance use issues. And so what happens is these specially trained de-escalation teams can go in and help do some community remediation if necessary, just help people talk out whatever the issue is, and then can connect folks with social services. A big issue here in the United States is that often those social services are extremely difficult to access, or they're not available. So again, here in San Francisco, there's this issue of, if you want to go and have somebody come in and speak and respond with somebody who is unhoused, there simply aren't enough beds to house that person. And then there's also this question of coercion, right? Like, who has the right to tell a person that they should go someplace or move, right? You need to make sure that there's sort of like assent there. And again, we have this very, very complicated safety net where the process of signing up for things like SNAP or WIC or TANF is extremely, or Medicaid, it's arduous. It takes a huge amount of paperwork. It's really, really difficult. The qualification process can take some time. And so I think that that's kind of a gnarly part of this too, is that very often social services aren't reaching the poorest and most vulnerable in the community. And it actually is, it's a big project for hospitals, homeless shelters, and other folks that are interfacing with people to get them benefits, right? I know I did a couple of years ago, a lot of reporting in some shelters in Chicago that were signing people up for the Medicaid expansion. But that meant, establishing an address for folks and getting their paperwork, figuring out their social security numbers, that kind of thing. So the complexity and difficulty of the American safety net, I think, is really at issue here. But that's something that's very amenable to policy change. We can make this all a lot easier. It's just kind of a matter of political will, because the reason that our safety net is so thin and so complicated, I think, has a lot to do with the fact that we fundamentally don't want people to use it and want to keep it kind of small.
I think this is, so Chris Shields asks, since Annie is a UBI expert, how will policies like UBI that alleviate some of the factors that lead to crime, i.e. poverty, help to reduce the need of police in some of these Black and Brown communities that are often over-policed?
Mm-hmm. It's a really good question. And we have a lot of evidence that shows linkages between poverty and crime. But I always kind of hesitate to say that the way to end crime is to end poverty. Like it's much more complicated than that. I think ending poverty in and of itself is a really good goal and a very, very achievable one through all sorts of policies, UBI being just one of them. But I do think, like, the way that I think about it more is just in terms of kind of community safety, right? Like, we have this policing apparatus that is very expensive and very large, and that nevertheless is leaving communities unsafe. We have a lot of food insecurity. We have a lot of insufficient schools, and the schools are really in bad shape. We don't have the kind of public transportation that a lot of other places have. And so doing all of those, like investing in those things, I can imagine, and in housing and that would reduce crime rates. I think that we know that, but I do kind of like to sort of keep those things separated and sort of say, well, isn't reducing poverty just, isn't that good on its own terms? Isn't the provision of public goods good on its own terms? Because there's still going to be crime. And, as we were talking about before, what counts as criminal matters a lot, matters a lot here. So that's kind of I feel like I sort of drifted around that question rather than answering it, but nevertheless.
And so this is the thing that we're kind of the entire nation's talking about now. I guess one of the things that history always tells us is that the things that are issues now are probably going to still be issues, but the cries might not be as loud about them. And particularly with former Vice President Biden saying, we want $300 million to an investment in the police, where kind of the defund movement saying we need to invest in some of these other things. Megan asked, do you think that this will become a salient issue in the presidential election? And I think I would tack on to that, kind of more than just kind of becoming a salient issue, because I think it's absolutely going to be a thing that presidential candidates are going to have to talk about in one way or another. But do you think it will continue to be an issue that kind of lasts through November?
I absolutely think so. I think that you are going to see pretty heavy polarization around this issue, though I'm not totally sure how that will shake out. We've already seen that Donald Trump wants to run a kind of law and order campaign. He wants to talk about Antifa, despite the fact that there's just no evidence that any of the protests or the riot or the looting had anything to do with Antifa, which is not like a organized movement. And I think that you know, it's hard to, there's also, God, it feels like an obvious point to make, but there's just so much going, right? Like we're in the midst of a completely historic recession, a public health crisis where they're now projecting 200,000 Americans will be dead from the novel coronavirus by September. And so it's a little bit hard to say, you know, how salient things will be. But I do think that you've already seen just tremendous movement on public understanding of and how much the public cares about these issues. One thing that I'm really interested to see is how much policies to ameliorate things like the racial wealth gap become an issue for Democrats. So, you know, right now, Joe Biden has a policy team that is sort of putting together currently a platform. He has absorbed a lot of advisors from other campaigns as he's sort of consolidated. And I'll be really fascinated to see, yeah, what they do on criminal justice reform and policing reform, but also more broadly on the question of disinvestment in racist disinvestment in Black families and Black communities. There's a lot of really great ideas out there. And a lot of policies that would really help are, as a technical point, race neutral. So Derek Hamilton is a really amazing economist at Ohio State. He and his co-author Sandy Darity had this really good proposal for something called baby bonds, where you would give a pool of money to every baby born to a family with low wealth. And so it would be race neutral. It costs like $60 billion a year, which is a lot, but not a huge amount. And then the money vests when they're 18. And this was seen as one of the most effective policies to address racial wealth gap. And so whether that kind of policy, there's a lot of other options, is something that's taken up by the Biden campaign, I think will be really fascinating. And also I just know that, you know, public opinion and understanding of this is changing really quickly. And even the Black Lives Matter movement is only 6 years old now, 7 years old, right? And so, you know, when the public decides to, how the public values things and how public opinion shifts, I think is always a little bit unpredictable, but it does feel like this has been a bit of a watershed. And I think seeing Republicans realign on these issues in some ways has been even more stark and fascinating than seeing how Democrats are realigning.
And one last question. You know, we have seen, as you mentioned, a shift on how people receive the term, even just the term Black Lives Matter,
yeah.
From, you know, 2014 to now. Do you think that, you know, there is a lot of kind of misunderstanding about defund? There's a lot of kind of aversion to the term and also to the practice and the act of defunding the police. Do you think that, you know, a few years from now, a few months from now even, there is kind of that similar shift between what we've seen over the last several weeks, where you can just see consistent video of police over aggressive policing, kind of abusing their power?
Yeah, I think that defund the police is sitting at the outside of the Overton window right now, right? It's kind of that leftmost pole, and it has moved into the discourse in an unbelievably rapid and fascinating way. But defund the police is, as you point out, it doesn't capture all of this nuance of what you're actually talking about, what you're refunding, how you're shifting financing priorities, and that's going to be hashed out. And in some ways, I think it's, when you look at other sort of political slogans, there's this question of what does it become shorthand for? So repeal and replace was a slogan that Republicans used for a decade, right? They never actually managed to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act. Instead, they just sort of chipped away at it and made the systems harder to use. In some cases, added work requirements to Medicaid, which has since been stripped back. And so there's always just a huge amount of policy complexity behind these little slogans. And I think the question is, what does defund the police become a shorthand for? Does that become a sign that you are a progressive who wants police reform and investment in community policing and investment in other things that would make communities safe? Or does that sort of remain that kind of more radical pole of no, we're talking about abolitionism and shrinking these forces because they can't be reformed? I don't actually, I'm not actually sure. But I would note that the people who are really concerned about backlash against that 3-word phase, again, mainstream Democrats are pushing back against it. They're not adopting it. And I think that we've seen that there's been this tremendous shift really quickly in public opinion to say, oh man, like police brutality is a real problem, and Black Lives Matter, and anti-Black racism is a systemic problem in America. And so I think that there's probably a lot of hope that that's just going to remain that kind of like outer flank, and that we're going to see a lot of generative policy change towards these goals, even if they're not that kind of radical goal.
So we're going to leave it there. Annie, thank you for this fantastic conversation, and thanks to all of you for watching. And we hope you will subscribe to theatlantic.com and to our journalism at theatlantic.com/subscribe. And we also hope that you'll join us for our next event cast. The Atlantic's own Adam Server will be talking with Lonnie Bunch, the Secretary of the Smithsonian, about this moment in our society and what connections we can draw to our history. That's on Tuesday, the 16th at 11:30 a.m. Eastern Time. We'll send you more details via email, so stay tuned for that, and we will see you on theatlantic.com.